Hello, geometry students. This is Mr. Schussler. Today we are going to be learning about angle relationships. Our lesson objectives for today are to identify and use special pairs of angles and to identify perpendicular lines. So go ahead and write those down in your notebooks. First off, special pairs of angles. So we're going to look at a few different pairs. First off, adjacent angles. So what is an adjacent angle? An adjacent angle are two angles that lie in the same plane, so they are coplanar, and have a common vertex. And a common side, but no common interior points. For example, angles 1 and 2 are adjacent angles because they all lie in the same plane and have a common vertex and one common side. These are non-examples. So angle 3 and angle ABC are non-adjacent because even though they have a common vertex and a common side, this is a common side, they have an interior point here. And so that means they are no longer adjacent angles. In this case, angle 3 and ABC do not share a common vertex. They have different vertex. Our next type of special angle pairs is a linear pair. Now, a linear pair is a pair of adjacent angles with non-common sides that are opposite rays. Remember, we talked about opposite rays last class, or 2 classes ago, sorry. So for example here, 1 and 2 are linear pairs. Angle 1 and angle 2. These are not linear pairs. ADB and ADC, because they are not opposite rays. Remember, opposite rays are collinear, meaning they lie along the same line, but they are in opposite directions. Finally, vertical angles. Vertical angles are two non-adjacent angles formed by intersecting lines. Meaning, here we have an example of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So when these lines cross, they create vertical angles. This is a non-example because we don't have 2 intersecting lines. This is not a line. These are 2 rays, and this is a line. If we look closely at the vertical lines, we also see that 1 and 3 could be adjacent angles, but to be a vertical angle, 1 and 2 are vertical angles because they are non-adjacent angles. The next angle pair relationship that we're going to look at is complementary angles. So complementary angles are 2 angles with a measure that have a sum of 90, meaning when combined, they create a right angle. So both angles 1 and 2 and A and B are complementary. Also, we should note, vertical angles are congruent. So angles A, B, and C are congruent with D, B, and E, meaning they have the same value. Next, let's look at supplementary angles that are 2 angles with measures that sum 180 degrees. Examples are 3 and 4, 3 here and 4 here, and P and Q, because P is 120 and Q is 60. When added together, they create 180. We should also note that angles in a linear pair are supplementary, but not all supplementary angles are a linear pair. For example, P and Q are supplementary angles, but they are not a linear pair because they are not formed using opposite rays. Next, let's try a problem. So we have algebra meeting geometry. So go ahead and try this problem in your notes first. Now that you've tried it, let's work through this together. So we're going to find the measure of two supplementary angles if the difference in the measures of the two angles is 180 degrees. So first, supplementary angles means that angle A plus angle B equals 180 degrees. But we also know that angle A minus angle B equals 18. So now we can put them together and solve for our answer. If we rearrange this formula, we can get A is equal to 180 minus B. We can substitute in, remember in algebra. So we end up with 180 minus B equals 18. Now if we add two b's to both sides and subtract 18, we end up with 162 is equal to 2b, and 81 is equal to the angle B, which we can then sub back into our equation to find that A so these are our two answers. Next, we're talking about hashtag perpendicular lines. Unfortunately, I thought a hashtag had perpendicular lines. If we look closely, they are not perpendicular lines. So don't use that hashtag. Back to our lesson. All right. So perpendicular lines are lines that intersect to form four right angles. Perpendicular lines intersect to form congruent adjacent angles. Remember what our terms mean. Next, segments and rays can be perpendicular to lines or other line segments and rays. And the right angle symbol in the figure indicates that lines are perpendicular. So that's important to remember. The right angle symbol, which you will see right here, shows that these two lines are perpendicular. The symbol is an upside down capital T and can be read like this. Line AD is perpendicular to line CB. Now let's look at an interpretation, so that we understand what we can and cannot interpret from a diagram. Because in geometry, figures are sketches used to depict a situation, but they are not always drawn to reflect total accuracy. So, for example, from this diagram, we can assume that all points are coplanar, meaning they are all on one plane. We can assume that G, H, and J are collinear on the same line. We can assume that all of these lines and rays intersect at H. We also can assume that H is between G and J. We can assume that L is interior of angle MHK, that these two are adjacent, and MHL, that these two are a linear pair, and that J, H, K, and K, H, G are supplementary. These two are often go together. But it is important to remember, this is where it gets important. We cannot assume that this is perpendicular because there is no line. For example, if there was this line in there, we could assume, but since there's not, we cannot assume that. Next, we can assume, or we cannot assume, that these are congruent angles, or that these are congruent segments. So when looking at a diagram, it is important that we look for those symbols that will tell us what the sketch is trying to depict. Now let's see, were you paying attention? From this figure, can we assume that these lines are perpendicular? Go ahead and try this. The answer is no. We cannot assume that because there is no perpendicular symbol. One more example. So go ahead and try this example in your notes. Now that you have tried it, let us answer it together. Determine whether each statement can be assumed from the figure. So can we assume that KHJ, and GHM are complementary? Remember, complementary means when added together, they equal 90 degrees. And no, we cannot assume that. There's nothing in there that tells us we can assume that. Can we assume that GHK and JHK are a linear pair? Linear pair meaning when added together, they equal 180 degrees. And we can assume that because we know that these are collinear. J, H, G are collinear points. And we also can see that they are congruent. Next, is HL perpendicular to HM? If we look closely, we can see that it has the right angle symbol. You can see that right in here. And so, yes, it is perpendicular. This is all I have for today's lesson, geometry students. Thank you for listening. You will find practice problems on PowerSchool Learning, so go ahead and work on that. Also, we will be submitting our notes today, so refer to PowerSchool Learning for instructions on how to submit your notes. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, please talk to Mr. Schussler in the Zoom call.